Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday seminar. Taylor Fravel, Director of MIT's Security Studies program. Today is a very special day because we are welcoming back one of our own, an illustrious graduate of the program, Lena Andrews, who I'm just tickled is here with us today. She is currently an associate research professor at the University of Maryland in their School of Public Policy. More importantly, for our purposes today, she's the author of an award-winning national bestseller, Valiant Women, the extraordinary American servicewomen who helped win World War II. She's had a really interesting career. She served as a military analyst for the Culinary Institute of America in Washington, D.C., the Central Intelligence Agency, and also worked at the RAND Corporation and the United States Institute of Peace. Her work has appeared on a wide variety of important news outlets, MSNBC, PBS, CNN, Today, People. So SSP and People. I think that is a first, I believe. Time and elsewhere. She's a native of Boston, Massachusetts, and as I mentioned, she received her PhD from us. So, Lena, tremendously warm welcome to you, and welcome back.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be back. Everybody can hear me, I hope? Okay. My son's brought home a bioweapon recently, and I haven't shaken it yet, so I'll be a little raspy today, but my enthusiasm is enormous. I am so happy to be here back among many familiar faces. Hopefully, you will be kinder to me this time around now that I'm at the front of the table. Just kidding. I know you won't. But I am really thrilled to be here back among so many friends. I would also, I have to say, be remiss if I didn't say that. One familiar face that is missing is Owen Cotes, and I miss him tremendously. For those of you who don't know, he was an enormous influence on me when I was getting my doctorate, both professionally and personally. He was a glimmer of kindness and joy and everything that you would want while you were in the depths of World War II research. But I know that the best way to honor him, aside from wine, is to tell you something fairly niche about World War II that I think is in fact very illustrative of something bigger and much more important. He was the master of the anecdote. And to be quite honest, the backbone of this book is really just an illustrative anecdote. So that is what I'm going to be doing today. As Taylor mentioned, my book is called Valiant Women, the Extraordinary American Servicewomen who helped win World War II. It came out about a year ago. And that's the cover, in case you're wondering. The first thing I like to say to folks, or tell folks, is where the title came from. I get that question a lot. It came from a quote by Harry Truman that's been engraved on the World War II memorial. And it says here, as you can see, our debt to the heroic men and valiant women in the service of our country can never be repaid. They have earned our undying gratitude, and America will never forget their sacrifices. And while I'm quite confident, and I think rightly, we have honored the service, the heroic service of men in World War II, I think we have a little bit more work to do in honoring the valiant women who did the same in World War II. And so that is part of the reason that this book is called Valiant Women. It's a bit of a rejoinder to Truman's quote. Also, you'll notice any book about women in World War II almost always has the term girls in it, and I found that infuriating. So we worked really hard to find one with women. So that's where we got the title. The other housekeeping note that I'll just say from the outset is that this is not an academic book. You know that because it sold a bunch of copies. I won't tell you how many, but it was a lot, which I'm very proud of. I'm very proud of the fact that this is a trade book. It was published by HarperCollins, Mariner Press. And it was a very intentional choice that I'll talk about a little bit later. And I can certainly talk about in the Q&A for any of the students here who are interested in maybe doing something a little bit different. But that means one thing above all else, which I'm thrilled to announce, which is that today's talk is not going to be a political science talk. I am not going to show you a 2x2. I'm not going to tell you about a theory. I'm not going to show you a regression, certainly, of anything today. Because one, I don't really do that anymore, and I don't have to pretend to. So I'm going to tell you a really good story. And I think that's an important thing to say from the outset, because sometimes, particularly the students' room, you may feel your success is predicated on answering questions that can be answered with a regression. That is not true. I'm here as proof of it. But all that being said, I was born and raised in the house that Barry Posen built, which means that everything that I do, this book to making my breakfast in the morning, is infused with IR theory. I cannot help it anymore, to the great annoyance of my friends and family. I think as a sort of trained political scientist, and especially as someone who has a deep appreciation for theory and for academic debate and for big questions. And so I will talk a little bit about how those things have fused together in this book. So given that, here's the outline of the talk today. I didn't have this slide, and then I thought, oh, I'm coming back home. I got to do an outline. So I did. You'll notice everything is in quotes for the reason. One, I'm not going to tell you about a debate, because there is a debate, but really I like to think of it as more of a conversation. The theory and the academic literature that I'm speaking to, that I'm in dialogue with in this book, if you read it, you probably wouldn't notice it, but it is there. So I want to tell you a little bit about that. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my argument, which I actually think is probably the closest thing to a political science argument here, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then last but not least, I'm going to talk to you about my case studies, which is in very big quotations, because my field work for this was a little bit different. I can't tell you about the modeling that I did or the snowball interview strategy that I had. I just talked to very interesting women on Zoom during COVID, and it was amazing. So I highly recommend it. Getting a 98-year-old on Zoom who's both blind and a little bit deaf has been the greatest accomplishment of my career, getting her story down on paper. So we can talk a little bit about what my case studies look like, but really they are just, I think, as I said, really interesting illustrative examples that point us in an important direction. Okay, so with the caveat that I'm not going to, play the game here and pretend I'm really engaging in a huge academic debate here. There is the school that I was raised in. My dissertation, the thing that I spent so long thinking about, was why and really how the Allies won World War II. There are many, many theories out there of what the decisive factor was. There are these are a couple of them. I could probably make a list twice this long of ways in which people have argued for one or the other thing. Some people say it was about the stuff. Other people say it was about the doctrine, something about maybe endurance or adaptability and innovation, which I spent most of my career here thinking about. Civil military relations, that's a big one. People like to talk about that. We had really good or bad, depending on the theory. And leadership, I talked about Owen. He was a big proponent of service leadership and that sort of thing. So there are lots of theories out there about what the decisive thing was. And if you wanted to do a little thought experiment, which I have, you could essentially chart the sort of history of how we think about the Allied victory in World War II. It's having two big phases. There was sort of a phase at the beginning of the turn of the century about, not the turn of the century, excuse me, the middle part of the century, about the amount of stuff we have and how it was all, about the material and the actual things that we fought with. And then I think more recently in Wright, we sort of swung back to more qualitative explanations, things about the leadership or the doctrine or things like that. Really, I'm going to argue that it's probably both. I'm not really going to argue it again because it's a conversation. We're dialoguing here. I'll remind you of that. But it is, in my view, a little bit of both. And I just should say at the outset, studying World War II and then going into policy might seem like an interesting choice to some of you in the room. I think there is no war that is more timely than this one, especially today. And in my experience in DC, I think that's been borne out. The last time we were talking about a ground war in the Middle East, as of several weeks ago, a ground war in Europe, and a potential large-scale naval and air campaign in the Pacific was this war. So there, I think, are a lot of things to learn from this. And I just like to say, for those in the room that have any doubts, although in this room it's probably not a big proportion of folks, that this war still matters enormously. And I found that to be borne out in the policy community as well. Okay, so we have all these theories about what was decisive in World War II. But the problem that I faced when I was looking at this literature is that I am not a very good political scientist, if you haven't guessed, despite Barry's best efforts to make me one. I really struggled to be convinced that any of these one things was decisive. And I'll tell you a little bit about why I thought that was the case. I'm basically saying the same thing 3 times here, but I think it's worth emphasizing. So here we go. The first is I think that's a bit of a false choice. That any one of these things is, and this is like, maybe a straw man argument, you can get me on that later, but a lot of these variables work together. So I spent a lot of time thinking about innovation. A lot of people argue that quantity of material and innovation go together. Really tricky problem for me in my dissertation was figuring out whether too little stuff or too much stuff got you more innovation. That was something I spent a long time thinking about. The point is that those variables move together quite often in World War II. And I think that is the case for many other of the sort of big variables that people point to. The other, and this is probably anathema in the room that I'm in, but I think World War II is pretty overdetermined. There's too much going on. There are too many things happening in this war to really weigh, I think, the relative significance of any one variable. So I'm saying it, for the second. I think it's kind of a fool's errand that I spent, 6 or 7 years erranding on and coming home empty-handed. And this is the final thing, which is that, and this I think is probably the closest to what I really mean. Depending on where and at what level we look, the answer to the question of what was decisive in World War II changes. And I think some of the best theories are really honest about this, right? So if we look at the strategic level in the Pacific, our answers to this question may look very different than if we look at the tactical level, a tank battle in Europe in 1944. So I think that creates a sort of difficult position for someone like me. And I finished my dissertation. I got to DC. I was starting to write a book about tactical air power in World War II and how important it was, and all of these things about how one specific thing could work. And I realized that I wasn't very good at this, and I gave up. That's essentially what I did. But I realized that's not necessarily a very helpful place to start. I can recognize that, and I can say that it left me a little bit sad. After 6 years of trying to pretzel my own argument about the Allies in World War II, I was sort of faced a really difficult decision. But then I had an epiphany. One day at a book party, after 1 or 2 drinks, I was talking to a friend, and they said, "Why haven't you gotten me your dissertation yet? It's a book or an article or something." And I said, I really can't focus on it. I think it kind of feels like a fool's errand. I feel very like Sisyphus or something pushing this boulder up the hill. And they said, "Well, what are you interested in? What is sort of the bee in your bonnet these days?" And I said, "Well, look, I don't think it's the decisive factor in World War II, but something I've noticed in reading all of these books about World War II, I mean, at that point I'd read all of them, is that somewhere deep in a chapter, in case chapters or deep in the theory chapter, there was always this one variable that kept coming up, that kept being included in all of these discussions about the victory in World War II. And that variable was combat support. Rarely was it the thing that everybody sort of cared about or made really flashy or interesting. It was rarely the sort of center of a theory, but it was in almost every theory. Almost every book about World War II talks about combat support functions. So I told them, I'm kind of fascinated by combat support. I think they're essential. I think they're overlooked. And I think they were if not decisive, very, very important in World War II, certainly for the Allied case. So what am I arguing about combat support? Just this. It's very simple. This is a trade book. It's for a broader audience, which essentially means that it's important, it's overlooked, and we should pay a little bit more attention to it if we're thinking about fighting wars in the Middle East, Europe, and the Pacific. Okay. So combat support I define very broadly because, again, I'm doing this for a wider audience. And I think this consists of exactly 1 paragraph in this book. So that's to give you a sense of how much time I spend on it. And I'll also say that even in the US, the services define combat support functions very, very differently. The Marines will tell you things are included in it that the Air Force doesn't. But essentially, it's the functions that generate, support, sustain, and allocate material and men. You can think of them as everyone who's not on the front line. And to make that point to illustrate a little bit more vividly, I'll just give you some examples, right? I should also say this goes by many different names. Some people call it combat support. Other people call it non-combat elements. Some people call it supply and logistics more broadly. Some people call it combat service support. But essentially, I think the best way to think about it is by definition. These are ground force definitions. You can do the same thing in the Navy and the Air Force. But when you think of combat elements, you think of infantry, armor, cavalry, artillery, air defense, combat engineers, the guys who are doing the sort of frontline fighting. They're right there day in and day out, shooting their guns, doing their thing. The combat support elements are what some other people call tail, right? If this is tooth, then combat support is tail. And they're units like communications units, medical units, maintenance units, supply, transportation personnel, the stuff that, like I said, everybody mentions in their books about World War II, but very people take sort of seriously as a war-winning variable. And so these are things like signals units who are ensuring the timely and effective communication between headquarters and rear elements, or frontline elements, I should say. Supply forces who are deciding what goes when, where. Personnel units, people like the adjutant general in the Army, who are responsible for keeping tabs on the overall manpower picture and deciding for helping decide where forces are going. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about combat support. It's a big bucket, and I'm doing that intentionally because I'm making this argument again for a larger, sort of wider audience of people who, where this sort of clear distinction is very helpful. So these forces may never fire a bullet at an enemy soldier, but they are specialists in their field and they enable and enhance frontline units. So my favorite quote from anything I've done on World War II is this one, which is the Chief of Army War Plans, and I think this is 1941-ish, in which he says, 100,000 airplanes would be of little value to us if these airplanes could not be used because of lack of personnel, operating aerodromes, and lack of shipping to maintain the air squadrons in theater. And that is functionally the argument, again in quotes, that I'm making. And I think, quite frankly, if we want to understand how the Allies won the war, we also need to understand the supply and support and combat support enterprise. And it's fairly axiomatic in the military community. I think most people who served in uniform will tell you that support units are essential to them doing their jobs. I found this to be the case almost instantly when I went to DC and I was doing military analysis with folks. The number of hours and time we spent on support operations as opposed to frontline stuff was, I think, surprising to many people, but it doesn't seem to have made its way into the larger conversation about fighting large-scale conventional peer-to-peer conflict. And I mean that really, when I say that, I mean the civilian conversation. And so this is particularly frustrating in this climate, as I said, because we're talking about a lot of very big, very manpower intensive and material intensive wars that will require a lot of combat support. And I mean a lot. And I think military leaders for a long time have been pounding the table saying we need this and not doing it. And so this, to give you just a sense of a more sort of recent example, this is tiny, this is 2 years ago now, but I still like the example, so I kept it in. You guys will remember in like early 2023, there was a big debate over whether or not we're going to give the Ukrainians German tanks. Turns out we gave it to them, and then they couldn't use it because they don't actually work or lack spare parts or didn't have the maintenance. So this is not just a problem of World War II. This is a problem, an everyday problem that militaries face around the world. And to give you a sense, this was 62 tanks. In World War II, the US alone produced 88,000 tanks, 1.4 million trucks by the best estimates. So this is a problem that if we face it today and we don't have the combat support infrastructure, we will be in trouble fast, very, very fast. Okay, so if this message, if you're me now, 5 years ago, you've had this epiphany about combat support, you want to write a book about it. It's this sort of younger brother of military effectiveness that people talk about but aren't really that interested in. How do I make this point in a way that is interesting and thoughtful and honest, but also that breaks through this sort of barrier that exists between the sort of academic community and the larger policy community and, quite frankly, the public, right? That was a big part of what I was trying to do, what I've always wanted to do as an academic, is give the public an understanding of these critical things. And that's where women come in. During this period, I had also very serendipitously gone down to the National Mall, and there's a memorial called the Military Women's Memorial. It's a terrific one if you haven't been. I was just there in June, and they've done some exceptional stuff, as always. Anyway, I was there, I think I was on an SSP trip late in my career. And I discovered this number: 350,000 American women served in uniform in World War II. And as I was sort of arriving at the combat support theory of the war, I'm not even going to call it that, idea of the war, I was also starting to read some interesting memoirs of women who had served in World War II. And it occurred to me very quickly that this might be a way in, a way to tell the public something important about a military campaign that was sort of appealing in a wider way, interesting in a wider way than a traditional academic work. So why did I decide to write about women? The first is that, as Reese Witherspoon tells us, women's stories matter. There is, and I mean that seriously, she's pretty right on that point. I think there is inherent significance in telling women's stories, right? Women are part of the population. We should tell their stories. As a researcher, also, I've always been suspicious of any theories that excise large portions of the population from them. So if we're not paying attention to women, we're probably missing something. So they're important. Okay, it's good reason to write about women. They're important. They're also interesting, and this was important for me at the time that I was coming up with this sort of approach, which is to say there had been a recent proliferation of a lot of stories. Liza Mundy had just come out with Code Girls a couple years before, which if you haven't read, is exceptional. It had really changed the way I thought about women in World War II. And there was sort of a cottage industry now developing around women, which I was very pleased to see. But people were buying the books, and that I learned from my agent. I didn't know that was the case, but he was like, yeah, people really buy this stuff. Okay, great, let's do that. So that's number two. But the most important reason for me to focus on this is that it was illustrative of this point that I was trying to make. I've been trying to find a way into combat support that was really interesting. And overwhelmingly, it turns out that the women who served in World War II were largely in combat support roles. And so it was a way for me to tell a really important analytic and military story through a lens that might have a more popular appeal. And so once I cracked that nut, we were off to the races. So let's talk about women in World War II, why we're all here, the fun stuff. As I said, over 350,000 American women served in uniform in World War II. They were in every theater. They were in a majority of the available military occupations at the time, and they were in every service, and I'll talk about each service in a second. A couple broad points here. Most of the services were stood up at or about late 1942, early 1943. I'm only talking here in the book about American women in uniform. I decided to talk about women in uniform because I felt the Riveter, most people know that story. Women in manufacturing was pretty clear. There had been a lot of great stories about women spies, and also it would have been very difficult for me to write that book as at that time, analyst in the CIA. I would have been, I will say the agency was incredibly supportive of this enterprise, but that would have maybe been a little bit trickier. But I also thought, there have been movies about Virginia Hall and these sorts of things. But women in uniform, and particularly American women in uniform, hadn't gotten their due yet, I felt, in a sort of popular general way. And so it felt really important to give them that time. But even with that constraint in place, we're still talking about a lot of women. 350,000 American women served in uniform. I'll keep saying that over and over again. Now, because I'm going to remove a lot of people who know a lot about World War II, I have to say, that's relatively not a huge number. There is a critique to be had here. 16 million personnel served in uniform in World War II. So why is this little sliver of a group important? Well, I have two rejoinders to that. Neither of them are very good, but I'll give them to you anyway. The first is that comparing anything to World War II is a little bit unfair. Vietnam looks like a rounding error compared to the amount of stuff and personnel and people in World War II. So, okay, fine. It was big. The other thing I will add is that this is also a bit of a ploy, but in many cases, these women were replacing 2 or 3 men because they were so good at their jobs, and I'll talk about why in a second. So technically, I think it's closer to 1 million if you do that math. Sure. Yeah. Learn that here. But the last point I'll say is that by the standards of today, it's still a big number, right? That's about the size of the active duty Navy. It's twice the size of the active duty Marine Corps. So if you have a question about whether or not that amount of people can make a difference, I would suggest you talk to a Marine. That's, I know there's some in here. I don't see you yet. But the point is, it is a relatively small number, but it is also still a big number, big enough to be worthy of some inquiry, at least in the way that I'm doing it. Okay, so why did women enter the equation? Up until this point, essentially, the army had been able, not the army, the military, the US military had been able to fight most of its wars with just men. And this, I think, is a critical point, and it comes from George Marshall. If you read his memoirs, there are like 50 of them, but they are really great. And he's consumed with the issue of two things: time and manpower. And he knows that they're pushing in opposite directions. They will have less time and they will need more people. And the closer and closer we get to war, the more and more he becomes consumed with this. And he's a logistician. He understands that the demands of the battlefield are going to be enormous in any war. And at that point, it's not even as large as it gets. Absolutely fixated on manpower and personnel as something he needs to figure out early. And so the question becomes, should he have been concerned about this? And yes, he should have. The math was not good. And by its own admission, the Army says they do not have enough men. And we can talk about the War Manpower Commission and things like that. But frequently throughout World War II, there is a concern about the math, right? Which is that specifically if you're looking for white men of a certain age, you whittle down very quickly to a very small amount of people. And this is the key number that Marshall is consumed by. The men requesting deferment, why were they requesting deferment? It's because the manufacturing industry was asking for the exact same people that were going to fight the war, right? So you were robbing Peter to pay Paul. You needed the manufacturing to be filled with white men of military age, but you also needed all these guys to be fighting on the front lines. And that became a really big math problem for especially the Army, but eventually for all the services. Very early on in the war. I'm talking like 1940, 1941, they're aware that this is a problem. Okay, so that's where the women come in. I'm gonna skip over a lot of history about how the women's services emerged. I'm very happy to talk about it in the Q&A. It was not, if you can imagine, in 1941, 1942, selling the public on having 350,000 American women serve in uniform was not something that went down particularly well. But it was done. It did happen. And a lot of it was because the Army demanded, the Army and less so, but to a certain extent, the Navy demanded it. They needed it. And Roosevelt also demanded it. So there are 6 programs during the war. They're all established, as I said, basically over the course of 6 months, from summer 1942 to 1943. The largest by far was the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which later becomes the Women's Army Corps. They were started as an auxiliary, all sorts of logistical problems, but 150,000 American women serve in the Army through this program. The women accepted for volunteer emergency service, the cleverly named WAVES, are the Navy's unit. They have about 100,000 women sign up to serve in Navy uniforms. The Army Nurse Corps and Navy Nurse Corps together have about 75,000, so also in a large group. The Marine Corps, you'll notice they're called the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. Lieutenant General Holcomb, when asked why they didn't have a cutesy nickname like the other services, replied that they are Marines. They will be called Marines. So that's what they were called, Women Marines. And that's why the name isn't clever. Very interesting guy, complicated. Anyway, I thought it was a good retort. The SPARS, the Coast Guard SPARS, Semper Paratus, always ready is their motto. That's where you get SPARS. And the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, who at the time were a civilian organization, but were later recognized 30 years later. Long story there, but were later recognized for the military nature of their service. And they are a very interesting story, which I'll talk about in a moment. So one of the main goals of this project, and in fact, if you read the book, what I've been talking about for the past 30 minutes or so barely features, right? This is all sort of back stuff that I was doing in my head as I was doing the research. Most of what the book is doing is taking examples of women in each of these services and telling the war their perspective. But inherently in doing so, it directs us to really interesting elements of combat support enterprise. And so the goal was essentially, in some ways, to trick people into learning something about combat support through the lens of these women. And ultimately, I feature, I think, something like 30 or 35 women throughout the book. I've read probably hundreds of stories. In the end, I was able to interview 7 living veterans of World War II who are all, unfortunately, have passed since I started the book, and about another 12 or 15 families of women who served, who were able to give me lots of just really cool information. In many cases, in almost all cases, I would ask to talk to a woman who I found usually through the good old Google News Alert, and they would say that their mother or their aunt or their grandmother didn't remember her service or was too ill to talk to me about it. And so it's just a reminder that these stories are increasingly being lost. And so for me, this felt really important to bring these stories into the picture and to put them down on paper. So I'll take a few examples, we'll talk about a few examples, and then we'll have some Q&A, because I think it's fun to hear their stories. And I like telling them over and over again as loud as I can to as many people will listen. Okay, so let's talk about transport. So cool, right? Everybody wants to talk about transport. Turns out, very cool, very important. Everybody should be talking about transport, particularly in World War II, where transporting personnel, equipment, planes, whatever the case may be, from point A to point B is an enormous undertaking. Because you're traveling sometimes in 1942 with the planes of 1942 or the ships of 1942 fully across the globe, right? And then you're going back and you're stopping in Europe and you're stopping in the Middle East and then you're going back to the US. And the transportation infrastructure of World War II was exceptional. I haven't seen it laid out like on a globe anywhere, but I think it would be just a mess of red lines of how intensive it was to get things and people to the theater. One of the ways in which this was, I think, really borne out was in the context of offensive air power, strategic bombing. I couldn't come to SSP and not talk about strategic bombing. I had to do it. And the reason I say that is, right, because as many of you in this room know, strategic bombing is a major part of Air Force doctrine in World War II. Roosevelt and Marshall are big proponents of it. They direct lots of resources to strategic bombing. And in many ways, the US makes good on its promise. I like to note that in 1943, the US produces more aircraft than Japan and Germany combined, and goes on to do much, much more than that as the war goes on. Phil, you can check my facts later. But there is a very specific set of doctrinal demands that are being placed on all these aviation resources. Strategic doctrine and ground supportive, or air supportive ground forces, I should say, are huge doctrinal advances, very important, but they demand a lot of aviation, like a lot of aircraft to do both of those things and to do them well. And they require a lot of trained pilots to fly them, which in 1941 and 1942, it turns out the US doesn't have a whole lot of. So the Army knew this was the case. They planned accordingly. They trained a lot of people. They snap up a lot of military-age men, train them to be pilots, and throw them into conflict, whether it's in North Africa or Mediterranean or later in Europe and the Pacific. But here's the problem with sending all those guys overseas to fly planes, is that when you make a plane in Detroit, it doesn't necessarily mean it's in the right place for it to then go overseas. It has to get there. And when all your pilots are sitting in the Pacific, that means you have to find somebody to fly it. And for you to do that, of course, to fill that critical gap between the home front and the front line, you need someone else. A stat I like to lay out, the Air Transport Command, which is responsible for moving all the planes around the US, I think in 1942, they requested more pilots than there were in the Air Force at the time. That's how many people they need just to move planes around the United States. It's an enormous enterprise. So the question becomes, how do we get these planes consolidated at the right basis so that they can be deployed abroad to the pilots who are now trained to use them? Well, we ask women to do it, of course. This is Florine Miller. She's one of my faves. I really like her. She was a member of the Women's Army Service Pilots. She's got this amazing Southern drawl, and she gave us like terrific little speech that I listened to while I was doing my research. She learned to fly, like many women of this generation, from a barnstormer. She went up in a plane when she was a little kid, and she literally said, I felt for the first time close to God. Because if you'll remember in the 30s, right, nobody flew. Birds flew. Nobody was in the sky, but barnstormers were. And she was totally enamored by this. She goes on to, her family buys a plane. She gets her commercial and instructional rating before the war begins. She's got thousands of miles under her belt. And so she's one of the first classes that joins the WASP. She goes to Love Field in Dallas. And she's assigned to oversee the women pilots who are essentially responsible for ferrying planes. It's a subset of the WASP called the Women's Air Force Fair. Anyway, we don't have to talk about it, but it's a subset of the WASP. And one story I like to tell about Florine Miller, she's stunning, if you can't tell. She's also a scaredy cat. She says this in her speech that she gave. She's always in World War II aviation, right? You didn't have Google Maps. There were no computers. It was very likely that you might get lost while you were flying a lot of these planes. And it was very dangerous to get lost because it's not like you had a bunch of gas on the plane. And so she was a scaredy cat. She would always diligently map out all the landmarks. I mean, literally looking over the side of the plane in some cases to make sure she was in the right place. And she became an excellent navigator. So much that the guys who were the civilian men who were also doing this job would request to be with her when they were going cross country because they knew she would get to where she was going. And one of the guys would say, we always knew we were getting close to the destination, not because they were doing the computations themselves, but because she would start to brush her hair and put on her lipstick, which meant that she was about to land. Terrific story. I'm not making it up. She also found ways to put her high heels in the ammo compartments of fighters, which weren't being used at the time, so she could go out of the town afterward. She was a real treat. She also survived several close calls. She was involved in a very harrowing crash of a P-47, one of my favorite planes, World War II planes. She tells a really incredible story about landing it with a hole in the middle at Love Field with planes on either side and Jeeps lighting up the runway because she had knocked out the power during her crash. So anyway, that's Florine Miller. She is, if I just to put it in a little context, she is not unusual for the women of the WASP. They are an incredible and very interesting group of women. And in fact, my second book will be on women aviators because of their incredible stories. They're like out of a movie. But again, this points us in the direction and allows me to tell a story about transportation in World War II. Not the sexiest topic, but somehow Florine Miller makes it interesting. All right, we'll talk briefly about maintenance, and then I'll speed through the other examples. We'll see if we have enough time. So maintenance, another very interesting topic in World War II, at least I think so. The flip side of transportation is, of course, maintenance. This is especially the case in the later part of the war in 1944 and 45, when we run out of essentially the ability to create, we're making a lot of stuff, but it's quite expensive to do so. And at a certain point, the returns on making new things are vastly outweighed by just fixing the planes that are coming back pockmarked from the Pacific or whatnot. And as anyone who's ever owned a high-tech piece of equipment, like an iPhone, for instance, I'll tell you a little story. My husband said I'm doing this, but I'm going to tell you a little story. For 4 weeks, he was unable to charge his iPhone. We had many conversations about what he should do. Should he get a new iPhone? Should he take it in? So on and so forth. We'd finally resolved, okay, just order a new iPhone. And then yesterday morning, he tells me, I'm just going to go into the Apple store and see if they can fix it. They took a tiny little swab, cleaned out the plug, and the iPhone works perfectly, right? So this is why, in my personal life, maintenance is so important. It saved us a $600 phone. You can scale that up to the Army in 1944, which at one point is spending $1 billion a month on maintenance, and you can see how these things can have an enormous impact. The Navy, of course, was not far behind. In 1944 and 1945 especially, as they're beginning sort of the campaign to get to Japan's doorstep and encircle the Japanese forces in the Pacific, they are conducting a massive offensive across large expanses. That means that they've got something like 80,000 landing craft, 1,000 combatant vessels. I mean, it is really an enormous enterprise. And all those things are about to get shot up and need to get sent home to get fixed. But the manpower constraints that Marshall was so worried about in 1941, in 1944 had become extraordinary, right? At a certain point, the military has to cap its divisions because they can no longer, basically they have to stop getting new people into the Army because they don't have lots of political reasons, but essentially they need to get better at using what they have, right? In 1945, this becomes acute. So what do? They have women like Jessie Contrabecki. The Waves, the Navy unit. She was born on a kitchen table in Niagara Falls. True story. 10th child of 11, 6 of whom died of malnutrition, born to Polish parents. And she was placed in a children's home as a child where they gave her milkshakes. This is just like interesting anecdotes about the life in the 1930s. She was really kind of a special person, though. She worked at a shredded wheat plant, like in a scene out of I Love Lucy. She was put at the end of the plant and made a huge mess because she couldn't keep up, so they fired her. She went to the Bell Aircraft Corporation, worked for a little while in the civilian industry. But in 1943, she enlists in the Waves, and she goes to Hunter College, where all of the Waves were trained. She becomes an aviation machinist mate and is sent to Naval Air Station Jacksonville, which, if you don't know, is an incredibly important operation and supply depot, and they do a lot of maintenance. They do a lot of overhaul and repair. And one of the stories I like to share about Jessie Kondrabecki is when we were talking, she mentioned that she was one of the best on the line at Jacksonville, and they used to take groups of men over to show them how she would fix things. And I asked her, I said, well, why do you think you were so good at it? And she was like, I was fixing small parts, altimeters and gauges, and I had really small hands. So I think in some ways, when we look at women in these sorts of roles, we often think about all the things that women can't do. But what I love about Jessie Kondrabecki's story is that it tells us something about the ways in which women, just by nature of the physicality of them, can be quite unique, right? And can have a huge impact. So I like that story about Jessie Kondrabecki. All right, the last thing I'll talk about briefly is the signals units. I don't want to give the impression in these examples that women were only stateside. Thousands, tens of thousands of women served at or around combat theaters around the world. I often say, if you want to hear some of the most harrowing stories of World War II, talk to a flight nurse. They had some really brutal stuff that they saw. But signals units were often sent abroad. Women's signals units were sent abroad. And the reasons for this were twofold. During the later phases of the war, we're way overstretched. We're doing too many things. We don't have all the personnel and manpower that we need, as I've said many times now. And at the same time, we're getting less and less people. And so suddenly we're taking guys, as I just said, the Army and the Air Force and the Navy are starting to have to do more with the existing forces they have. They often are taking men from the rear and putting them on the front lines, which means there's all this empty space in the rear. And one of those places is signals units, communications units, and they start to bleed personnel toward the end of the war. It's hard to overstate the importance of signals and communication units in World War II. They laid cables, they transmitted, they translated, they were basically the eyes and the ears of headquarters on the front line. And this was in the era of radio, which meant you literally there was a physicality of it. It wasn't just like typing in your computer, which is of course still important today, but it was a much more sort of, it was much closer to the battlefield in many ways than it is even today. And so they started to look, as these units were bleeding men and still quite important on the battlefield, they started to look to women like Gertrude Pearson. I like her a lot. She grew up in New York, signed up for the WWII. The reason she tells the story of how she decided to join the Women's Army Corps, not any of the others. She actually went to the Navy recruiting station first and got in line and said, okay, I'm ready to serve, but I demand to be sent abroad. And the Navy said, we don't do that with Navy women, at least not yet, when she signed up. And she said, cool, see ya. Walked around the corner and went to the Army and said, will you send me abroad? And they said, sure, yeah, we're the Army, we'll do whatever. And she said, cool, great, sign me up and put at the top of my application, I want to serve overseas. And she did. She went to Daytona Beach, was one of the major WWII training institutions. She was told that she was going to be an administrative assistant. She wasn't. She was going to be a cryptologist. And she was assigned to an Army signals unit that deployed to France. Her first assignment was to be part of Operation Fortitude, the flooding of the Germans with signals and noise and things that they, to essentially confuse them about where we're going to land. And then later, August 1944, several months after the initial invasion, she then went to Normandy and provided signal support very close to the front lines, to the point that she could hear, the booms. On one occasion, she recounts talking to a suspicious-looking British woman who had German shoes. She reported her to security and was never seen again. So anyway, she was quite close to enemy lines, to say the least. All right, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. I don't want to give you the impression that this is all, trumpets and salutes and everybody's happy. This was an enormously difficult integration exercise. The women of World War II are exceptional for many reasons. Part of the reason they are exceptional is they served in the face of enormous disparagement. In 1943, there was a slander campaign lodged against the women of the Army, in which essentially in a syndicated column, which is the equivalent of, like Snapchat, I don't know what people use these days. Anyway, a big article about how Army women were prostitutes. It destroyed recruiting. They never really recovered from it, quite frankly, and it was just a morale killer. The hard part was that a lot of people believed it. There was enormous challenges for women of color in all of the services. I can talk a lot more about that. I talk extensively and integrated throughout the text about Black women's experiences in the Army and then later in the Navy. I talk a lot about Asian American women. We have some Japanese women who signed up from the internment camps to serve in the WWII. So that tells you a little bit about something about patriotism. Sexual harassment and violence were rampant. There were lots of reports of them. If you can imagine, if there were lots of reports of them, how much of it was actually going on. And it was often just sort of part of the routine day for these women. They often said that was just what it was like to be a woman in 1942, being asked to go to dances after a full day of work because the guys needed to pick me up. And then I talk about this a lot in the book. I have a whole chapter devoted to lesbian and queer women. I would say, in my humble opinion, that women would not exist in the armed forces were it not for a handful of very talented lesbian and queer women. I could talk about a couple of them. Most of them are not well known, and I try to give them some credit in the book for the incredible amount of work that they did, particularly around the stand-up of these organizations. There are lots of really interesting women who made this happen, and many of them were queer. Okay. They all came home. My favorite story to tell is about Dwight Eisenhower, and then I really will shut up and we'll talk. Eisenhower was an enormous skeptic, huge skeptic of women serving. It's all over his memoirs. He was like, I hated women, and he was really, weirdly open about it. But he got to North Africa, and as many of you know about Dwight Eisenhower, he had a lot of trouble early on in North Africa, couldn't get his headquarters together. So he requests a detachment of women. Marshall sends them over. Within months, he has requested basically 10 times that amount because he realizes, it turns out, that women are very good at administrative tasks. And he realizes the battlefield has changed, that women are necessary. He's so convinced of this point that after the war in 1947 and 1948, when they were debating whether or not women should be integrated on a permanent basis, so outside of a wartime contingency, he came out of retirement in Columbia and testified to Congress to say this, which is that I was vehemently opposed to this. I thought all of these bad things would happen, and none of them did. And in fact, we would be, he argued that the United States should never again be without the service of women. And lo and behold, in 1948, in large part on the basis of the service of women in World War II, Truman signs the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, and women are integrated on a peacetime basis into the armed forces. Lots more challenges ahead for women today and in the past, but I think we have a great deal of thanks to give to the women of World War II. So with that, I will open up for questions.
Thank you, Lena. That was terrific. And you know the drill here, so I'll untrap it.
Okay.
And let's see. So, Paulina, I saw you first. And Paulina, go ahead and ask your question. Anyone else wants to jump in, please keep your hand up so I can see it.
Yeah, thank you for this amazing presentation. It's very refreshing also because it's an interesting story, but told not in a political sciencey way. So I apologize in advance for being a mood killer here, because my question will pertain to something that we do in political science and might be of interest. So a lot of us here work with historical data, and there is a huge amount of the data that we don't get. Missing this is a major issue for us. So how do you, and for your project, you mentioned that you conduct 8 interviews. So there are a lot of selection biases that determine what kind of data we'll even get to. So how did you think about, when writing this book, about the stories that you cannot tell and will never be able to tell? And what would be your dream data that you wish you had, and what kind of stories you would be able to tell with those data if you have them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't talk a lot in any talks really about my research methods because the publicist I was assigned by HarperCollins was like, please don't talk about the research. And I was like, okay, I won't. So I've kind of forgot, I put a lot of it out of my mind, but your question is a very good one. And I approached this sort of as a political scientist, acknowledging that there was always going to be stuff that I couldn't access and couldn't get to. And that had a three-pronged strategy. The first was interviews, and I'll tell you all how I got the interviews that I did, which is I put on a Google alert in the middle of COVID for woman, World War II, and veteran. And that wouldn't have necessarily been a good strategy, except you'll remember right around 2021, 2022, two things happened. One, the COVID vaccine happened. And I learned later that the Department of Defense actually very explicitly was giving the vaccines first to World War II veterans and then having them be publicized in local papers to get people to take the vaccine. And so I had all of a sudden tons of hits about women getting the COVID vaccine. So that was a nice little silver lining of COVID. Kind of weird, but that's what it was. And the other thing is, if you do the math, most of these women were turning 100 in 2021, 2022, and 2023. It's another reason why I got a ton of hits on, wish Ethel, she's turning 100, send her a card. So I got a ton of those. And I reached out to, I would say in the end, probably 24, 25 living veterans. And I only got the opportunity to talk to 7 or 8 of them. The other thing that I did was memoir, the kind of standard thing there, a lot of memoir, and there are a lot of repositories that exist of women's service, of sort of firsthand records. There's a couple at the University of North Carolina. There's a repository. The Military Women's Memorial down in downtown DC has some. So there are a lot of actual repositories of recorded. The Veterans History Project. They're kind of all over the place, but you have to go out and look for them. And I would listen to these recordings, basically of women being interviewed by their grandkid that were part of this, these repositories. They were fantastic. And then the last thing I did was that particularly in the military women's veterans community, there were a lot of sort of niche stories that had been told about this with tons of amazing facts and stats. The best one that I've ever seen to this day was a green book from the Army Center for Military, the Center for Military History at the Army Center for Military History, about women in the Women's Army Corps. And they had some of the best facts and data, and like to your point of what the DREAM data set is, they had all that. They had the sort of full scope of what the sample was that they were looking at. The Marine Corps had something very similar. And I looked at a lot of archival data in the National Archives and also the sort of usual places. And that allowed me to cross-check what I was getting from the memoirs and from the interviews and from the families to say, is this representative of the samples that I can see through the sort of record keeping that's in the National Archives and other places. So that's how I did it. It was imperfect, of course, and I'm sure I'm not seeing a ton of stories. Most of them, like I said, are because these women have passed away or have lost their memory or, are just not interested in talking about it anymore. And I think that is to your question of what my ideal sample would be. I'd like to go back 50 years and talk to these women sort of in their prime. And I'll just say that when I talked to the women that I did talk to and their families, overwhelmingly, aside from the memory issues and the fact that they passed away, many of them said, and I start the book this way with a quote from one of my favorite interviews, Merle Caples. She said, "Oh my God, I can't believe you're interested in my story." And that to me is just heartbreaking. So I think there are so many women that was so often the case. And there were so many women who I think just didn't think that their stories mattered. And so they never told them to their families. They never told them to people like me. They never told them to the repositories or the military women's memorials. And that's the sample that I will never get. And so I end most of my talks for big audiences and non-academic audience by asking them, telling them if they know a veteran, and particularly a women veteran, to ask them their story and to listen very carefully.
Ben.
Sure. Thank you. This was an amazing talk and really an inspiration for all of us present participants in the program. One thing that really stood out about your talk is what you just mentioned, is that like a lot of these stories of service, when you found them, the Valiant Women had already passed or they had forgotten their history, and in part because people didn't pay attention to these stories for decades. And I'm really curious, as your perspective as a historian, when you think about modern wars in Gaza and Ukraine, whose stories do you think are being currently overlooked, either for similar reasons or reasons of political expediency, that in 7, 8, and 8 decades from now, historians will have to go back and revisit those stories because they weren't adequately captured by the present moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good, really good question. If I could go back, I would have, and convinced my editor this was a good idea. I would have done sort of a cross-national study of these things, because I think to a certain extent, the sort of cultural and strategic impulses of a state in a certain conflict dictates how they think about women in war, right? So I think about the Soviets, for instance, which had like women snipers, women pilots, the night witches, like Google them. Also, best name ever. The night witches. Okay, so so, and that's partly because of the sort of Soviet philosophy about war and the sort of mass and mentality of that. You could say the same thing about the Chinese in World War II. They were often more willing to integrate women. Taylor can tell me that if that's true. I'm just going to say it like it is. But you know, I think there are some sort of cultural and strategic elements to that. And as I think about wars today, I would sort of like to tease that out a little bit. I've seen a lot of stories about Ukrainian women, for instance, who are, because we're talking about such a small state against such an enormous state, the ways in which that has dictated women becoming involved. So I'd kind of like to think about that. It's not really a total answer to your question, I admit, but I would like to think about how the sort of strategic and cultural nexus dictates views towards women's participation today. I think that's also true of the United States. All of the women who served were volunteers, right? We weren't drafting, although we did consider it. We weren't drafting women, which I think is a product of our sort of strategic and cultural needs. But the other thing that I think is deeply under-resourced and understudied, I would say, one, the stories of people of color, particularly in the United States and their experiences. I pitched my editor on writing a book about American Black men in Vietnam. I think it'd be a phenomenal and very interesting book that wasn't the one we decided on in the end. But I think there are some really interesting stories and some interesting selection effects about what it takes for Black men to succeed in Vietnam, and sort of how that makes them sort of better at their jobs in some ways. I don't know if that's true, but that's my theory. And the other thing that I think we're missing, certainly from the US perspective, is stories of the queer community in the military. I just think that's still sort of a third rail. And in my experience, and you know, I think there is a lot of history to be told around that space. And it's just, I can count on my hands the number of books that have been written about that. And I think we're missing a lot of interesting stories about that. So those would sort of be my dream books to write. I don't think I will anytime soon, but I would love to.
Thank you for mentioning theory.
Just once. That's it, folks. Don't expect any more of that.
Apeksha.
Thank you for the talk, Lena. I really enjoyed it. My question is about how do we arrive at this 350,000 number and the interaction of like supply and demand forces? So is it that there were a lot more women than that who wanted to volunteer, but the demand was really small? Or was the demand really large, but there were patriarchal barriers to convincing women to also join the army? Because the barriers are not just on the institutional side, but also on the side of like convincing a large population of women who were also socialized in that environment to give up that home life and join the military. So I'm curious, like, if you have thoughts on that.
Awesome question. It's very much the latter. So there, as I mentioned, so I'll make this kind of short, but when women first arrived, first of all, there was a ton of skepticism, even among the leadership. Marshall, who knew he needed women, was a skeptic. Dwight Eisenhower, a huge skeptic. Admiral King, enormous skeptic. Holcomb was like off on a frolic. I don't know what he was thinking, but he was not. There's so much skepticism. But the moment that women arrived, basically on a dime, all of them started singing a different tune because they were very, very good at their jobs. And at one point, I think in the first year, this is the example I like to give. The first month, the Army had targeted, they wanted to get 10,000 women to serve in the first year. So I'll be a little clear. When they were launching the program, for the first month of the program, they said, okay, we are hoping that by the end of the year, we will get 10,000 women to serve. That would be great. We don't think there's a huge demand. If we can get 10,000, that would be fantastic. The first week of recruiting, at the New York recruiting station alone, there were 1,000 applicants for 30 slots. By the end of the year, there were 66,000 women who had signed up to join the Army. right? So the demand was enormous. Women wanted to serve, even sort of based on all of the hierarchical and social and cultural issues that they knew where they were facing. They wanted to serve, and this was the case throughout every service, right? So I think the Marine Corps hit I think they hit 11,000 of the 15,000 in the first year of their recruiting. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, but so I guess my answer to your question is two-part. In the early part, it was actually more the structural stuff. It was like that they didn't think that women would be useful, and then it turns out they were, and they kind of came around. But then in 1943, the slander campaign happens, and it truly decimates recruiting to the point that there was an FBI investigation over whether or not this was an Axis plot to diminish recruiting, because women were so enthusiastic, but then they sort of articles, all this suspicion about what they were doing, and it crushed enthusiasm. So I think it was a little bit of both, but by the end of the war, it was very much the sort of societal concerns that had become very loud about what this was doing to women and how dangerous it was, and you could become a prostitute and not even know it. You know, there was all of that that sort of got fused in. And that was especially the case, I think, at the end of the war, because the enthusiasm of 41, 42, 43 for fighting and winning this war had diminished considerably, right? And so you see a lot of really kind of harrowing and sad stories about the way that women are treated in the later part of the war, and a lot of that sort of patriarchal societal stuff diminishes, I think, the enthusiasm that was seen at the outset of the war. Did that answer your question?
Great. Ron.
Okay. Well, thank you, but not looking to expand your book, but you mentioned at the beginning the question of why the Allies won the war. Well, one significant factor was that the Germans made much more limited use of women than we did, and the Japanese even less. And not just in the armed forces, but even more so in industry.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. And a lot of my initial interest in combat support was born out of the stories coming out of Germany and Japan about the different ways that they sort of dealt with these issues. And women, of course, would be a terrific way into that story as well. And I completely agree with you. If one of you can convince my editor that I should write a 900-page book on the different experiences of women and across states, I would love to do it, because I do think there's a lot of grist for the mill there. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. This has been delightful. I have two questions, one substantive and one, I guess, a little more procedural. I want to go back to your comment about the productivity of women, or the specialized, apparently special, areas that they specialize in, or where they may have had comparative advantage. You had the line about, a woman could replace 3 men. I'm curious, like, what areas, you mentioned like fine motor skills, you mentioned administration, where women maybe actually did have advantages that were looked at, and whether you think that actually is something inherent to women, or, there is a big selection effect here, because with men you get everybody. With women you only get the ones who are really motivated and volunteer, right? So I'm just curious, like a little bit more about that. And then the second question I wanted to ask you is just actually about working with the trade press, and if you could talk a little bit about just what.
And we all want to make a little money.
Yeah, it's not lucrative.
This stuff sells.
Yeah.
So I'm just, I think most of us are very familiar with kind of the academic process, but if you could just break it down a little bit, like how did you actually do this, and what it was like, and how it works, it'd be very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So, yeah, I'm keeping him to myself. Don't worry. No, so on the question of women and their skills, where to begin? Okay, so the answer to your question, I think, is that given the careers available to women at the time, they were very, very good at very specific things that the military happened to need desperately when World War II started. So women were often secretaries. This was a war of paperwork. It was a filing, it was a decimal point, it was all of these, we talk about the Hello Girls in World War I, the same thing, except on an enormous scale. Women who were, telephone operators, secretaries, administrative assistants, all of that was enormously in demand. That's why Dwight Eisenhower actually is ultimately convinced he wants them not out in the field, but in his headquarters, filing stuff, finding things for him quickly, because it turns out the 18-year-old guy that he's hired to do it cannot do that job. But the 22-year-old woman who's been working in an office at Westinghouse for 4 years absolutely can. And in fact, this is pretty easy for her. So there's that sort of subset. And I talk in the book actually extensively about how we should not underestimate, even today, and certainly not in World War II, the enormous amount of paperwork that is required by wars, and how when you multiply those things over big groups of people fighting wars, those little administrative delays become very, very problematic, can become very problematic. So having good administrative support is important, and women could do that. The other thing I talk about is women were often teachers. That was a huge occupation for women at the time, which you wouldn't necessarily think would be translatable, but it turns out a lot of men needed to be trained on highly technical things for which they had very little familiarity. Things like flying a plane and a link trainer. Some of the best link trainers, which is, for those of you who don't know, is like a old school aircraft trainer. It's a little box, and they pull paper underneath it so you can pretend you're flying over France. But some of the best link trainers were women because they were teachers. They were used to breaking down really complicated concepts for kids and teaching them how to do things. And it turns out that when you're talking to a pilot, that also works. So not to say anything bad about pilots, but it's a similar sort of concept. So they ended up being really good. One of my favorite stories is a woman named Susan Ahn. She was Korean American and one of the first Korean Americans to really to rise to the top in the Navy. She went on to join the intelligence community, but she was so good at being a link trainer, they actually moved her over to be a gunnery instructor, which you can imagine. She's like 5'1", this very petite Korean woman trying to fire a 50 cal, right? How is she going to be the best teacher for that? Well, it turns out not every man is also enormous and capable of handling the kickback on a 50 cal, but she was creative enough to figure out how to hold it and how to wedge her foot in the cement behind her so that she could handle it. And she was able to then communicate how to be creative to other guys. So I think to a certain extent, when I talk particularly to women veterans and active duty women audiences, one of the things I like to say is that one of the great gifts of this research for me has been that the conversation about women in the military today and for time eternal has always been about what women cannot do. And the great thing about these stories is about what women can do, right? The things that they bring to the table that by virtue of training or schooling or just life have made them very good at. I do think you're right about the selection effect issue, and I don't want to sort of dismiss that as being unimportant. It is, particularly here, because these are all volunteer women. And so imagine the pluck it would take in 1941 to think, I'm going to join the Navy. That's a certain type of person. But I do think it really helps in the same way it redirects us back toward combat support. I do think it redirects us back to sort of how the diversity of skills is critically important in any campaign, certainly this one and certainly other campaigns today. Trade presses, they're great. I highly recommend them. Like I said, this was an accident. I was not planning to write this book. I was at a Frank Gavin's book talk for something before the pandemic. And I was talking to a friend about this and talked about this combat support thing and these women. And he said, oh, you should talk to my friend. He's a book agent. I said, sure. Yeah, why not? I'm not doing anything. So maybe this will motivate me. And I did. That's how I met my agent. He turns out to be a very capable agent and I like him a lot. And he said, look, if you write me a proposal, I'll pitch it. It sounds like an interesting story. This has got sort of all of the things that World War II audiences and military history audiences are interested in. I didn't work on it for several months, and then the pandemic happened, in which I did not have children, so that was very helpful, and I had a lot of time on my hands. So I like to say I got to the end of Netflix, and then I wrote the proposal because I had nothing else to do. Writing a trade proposal is very different than writing a sort of typical academic proposal. I don't think I've never done an academic proposal, but it starts off with like a really compelling story. I used Florine Miller and her P-47 crashing. That was my hook. And then it's about market and who's going to buy this book and why I'm the right person to write it, which is like horrifying. I will never show this proposal to any of you. It's antithetical to being an academic by talking about all your credentials. But it was, it was really well received. I was also pitching it at a time when there was like a lot of crisis around women in the publishing industry and particularly women of color in the publishing industry. So I think that helped get a lot of interest in this book. Not only was it a book about women in a sort of niche field, but it's also being written by a woman and a woman of color. And so anyway, long story short, we pitched it around to all the big houses. There was some interest in it. Usually you put it up for auction, but we were able to get what they call a preempt, which is just like what it sounds. Someone wants it so bad that they buy it ahead of time. And then I had to write it. And that was terrifying to me because I'd never written a trade press. But I will say this, and I have to give him due credit. When I was writing my dissertation, I did not think I was very good at anything because I was writing my dissertation. And I wrote, all these theory and case chapters. And then I wrote one chapter describing a series of battles in North Africa, which nobody cares about except for me, and maybe Phil and Barry. And at the end of it, there were very few notes from my illustrious advisor, Barry Posen. But at the very end, he wrote, I guess you can write pretty well. Which I wasn't at the Posen Fest last year, so I couldn't tell this story. But anyone who's received Barry Posen feedback knows that I have it like framed on my wall. I'm like, Barry thinks I can write well? Oh my gosh. And it was actually, I mean, truly, it was that sort of little glimmer of, okay, I can write not just well, but I can write about World War II well. That kind of got me over the hump of writing something narratively, because that was really the hard part for me. Huh?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Maybe. Possibly. I'm considering it. Well, the jury's out. So high praise. Anyway, long story short, that got me over the hump. But the big thing was writing it narratively. We changed the structure of it. We made it into more of a story that was told over time. And that was much more difficult for me, but I think ultimately really served it. And I had a great editor who really coached me along the way. So that's how it all happened. And then at some point we can talk about releasing a trade book, which is my personal nightmare, but also great, a lot of fun.
Excellent. Dick Samuels.
Yeah, my question has already been answered, although it wasn't directly asked, and that had to do with channeling my inner comparativist to find out more about what the relative gender balance was among the combatant militaries during World War II, if you had any data on that.
I don't, and I should, naturally, of course. Dick gets the gold star because he's asked me the question I've never heard and never thought of it, but should have, which is that I haven't actually looked across all the combatants to see how we shake out. I know that we learned a lot from the British who were doing this obviously at a much larger scale, and they were drafting women. And that was very complicated, and there were lots of really good archival materials talking between the leadership of those things. So we certainly learned from other states, but I've never actually sat down and done the numbers across all of the combatants to see how women were integrated. I'm going to do that tonight. So thank you for that.
China,
Yeah.
China and the Red Army. And those are the ones that first come to mind.
Yeah.
When I think about this issue, because they're famous for that.
Yes.
But I didn't know that Germany didn't do a particularly good job of recruiting women, didn't care to. I somehow have this suspicion that Japan did a miserable job.
Yeah.
And that sounds like it's right. But it would be very interesting to know what this number that you were using.
Yeah, no, and I should.
How that matches up with our allies and our adversaries during, sort of this last major global existential conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be, and because also it doesn't cut neatly between the Axis and the Allies, which kind of from a political science perspective, yeah, you're right. It is a really good point. So I wonder, again, to that strategic cultural element, whether there's any play to that. It's a great point. Yes.
Lauren.
Hi, thanks for this talk. I thought it was super interesting and was glad to see a project presented in this style. I have two questions. One is sort of a niche question, one is a generalizability question. So the niche question is this. I've looked into these archives in the UK, that's where I'm based, and one of the things that I think is really interesting about the difficulty collecting these stories is that a lot of times women were told that their work was secret, and then the projects just ended, and they went home, and there was never any information about when and why and where they were allowed to tell these stories. And I'm wondering if you can comment on whether that was also a challenge in the US, or to what extent. How much does kind of secrecy affect what we know or don't know about the stories of women here? And the generalizability question is, what would you like the US Armed Services to learn from this book? What are the things that need to be different, and what can change that you think would matter for winning the next war?
On your first question, it's a really good one. I think to a certain extent, so I sort of excised a lot of the sort of traditional OSS top secret stuff from the scope intentionally because of my own, personal tricky situation. But you're right. There was, for instance, I talk a little bit about a woman named, excuse me, Catherine Keene, who was part of the OSS in the Army, and her archives are at Harvard. And she kept this little diary, a day-by-day diary of everything she was doing, but it was totally sanitized. So I was so excited when I found it. It had her little woolly book of German supplies that she would put in her belts. All of that was there. But then the letters home and the journal was so sanitized because, I don't know if it's because she was a woman or because she was intelligence or both, but she was so sort of conscientious about leaks and things of that nature. So there's definitely, even where I knew something was happening, there are women's stories that I'm definitely missing. I think though, because a lot of them ended up in the support functions, there was less of that issue. It was less widespread, I would think. That's more of a guess than it is based on anything empirically. But the trickier question was simply, getting them to say it or to write it down or to tell a family member or any of that. I can't tell you the number of emails I've gotten from people saying, I wish I had asked, I wish I had, and also like later in life, they would get a little looser lipped, after 75 years, they're like, whatever. But, one case I'll just say, I didn't talk about this. I usually start most talks with a woman who was essentially doing some of the most classified research in the world. And she would never tell her family about her. Her name is Evelyn Zahn, and she's a grandmother of a friend. She was probably drawing maps in France based on enemy intercepts. But what was interesting is, having been sort of in the intelligence world and in the military space, I could back into some of that. Just by knowing what she wasn't talking about or knowing what she wasn't saying. So that was kind of helpful. I think you get a feel for what they're not saying. And where she was and what time and she was a cartographer, she was really good at drawing, so you can kind of back into it. What was your second question? I've already forgotten. I'm sorry.
The second question is about what you think the U.S.
Yeah. Great question. So I've had the privilege of giving a lot of talks, especially to organizations of active duty and veteran women recently. And it's been a really meaningful experience. I often say the only review I care about is women veterans. The rest of you are whatever. In large part because they have been the stewards of this history. And so I was always very conscious of the fact that I was an outsider and that I needed to be very careful and very thoughtful about my approach to this, and also very honest. And I think that I was an outsider allowed me to be a little bit more hoorah about what the women were doing in ways that I think the veterans community, they're not in it for that. So I think that was one of the great privileges of being a civilian doing this. But one thing that I wish, and I found this to be the case, I was just at the largest conference of active duty service women in the country over the summer. And it was such a to walk into a room of 1,300 women in uniform was like profoundly meaningful to me. But what bummed me out was then I got up on stage and I talked about 3 of these stories, and I asked, for a hoot and holler if they knew who they were. And only one of the women got a really loud round of applause. And so I think what makes me concerned is that there's a very small community, mainly of women veterans, who know this history and who know it well, but the larger armed services don't. And I can tell you right now, every single debate that we've had about women in uniform since World War II already happened in World War II. We had it, we solved it, we did it, it's over, the debate is over, and we are still having it again in 2015 and 1973, all over again. And so there's a deep frustration for me about the fact that this history is not more widely known, particularly within the sort of armed services. I think that could be, and outside of the women's veterans community. I think and that's part of the reason I wrote the book. I want, as much as I want women veterans to read this, I also want, men serving in uniform or like old grandpas who have read everything about World War II to also read this book, because I think it's just as interesting and just as important and tells you something about today.
Eric.
This was super fun, Lena. So obviously this is a book that talks about combat support roles, but you've alluded in your conversation to women in these higher risk roles, right? Whether it's in the OSS, whether they're serving in combat in other countries. And we know this debate about women in combat roles is something that has long persisted, probably for way too long. As you were doing your research, did you come across any examples of senior leaders even thinking about using women in combat roles in World War II, or is that just too taboo?
It's interesting. The thing that immediately comes to mind, two things immediately come to mind. One is flight nursing. I mentioned this briefly. I'm not kidding. These women were the things that they were doing and seeing, they were in many cases, the example I like to give is that, because of supply issues, big surprise, they would use not Red Cross, but hospital flights as supply flights, which meant that they couldn't have a big Red Cross painted on them. So they were basically target. The women, the flight nurses who were on these planes were bringing munitions into the front line. And so they were fair game because they were not technically medical flights, which means that these women as a group have some of the most harrowing stories. There's a story of 13 women who were shot down in Albania, which at the time was occupied the Germans and the Italians, and had to hike their way out of Albania on foot with like a rebel on a white horse, quite literally, over the highest mountain pass in winter. And that was like their experience in World War II. So tell me that's not combat. I've thought actually about writing it as a movie. I'm like, there's one book written by this woman, it's called Albanian Escape. Read it. It's like unhinged. I mean, it is unbelievable what these women were doing. So flight nurses is the first place that I think of as sort of where there had to be an acknowledgement of these women who were doing these incredible things, often very much in combat, just because of the nature of the way the medical community was arranged in World War II. I talk about them a lot in the book. I'm trying to remember what my other thought was about women in combat. It'll come to me, but I do think, this is the other thing, women in guns. This was a huge thing, whether or not women in uniform could carry weapons or be trained in weapons. And initially there was a big mandate to say that they couldn't because like it was too, God forbid we give them a gun, Meanwhile, half of these women were like sharpshooters from Kentucky or whatever. So they could use a gun. And there's a funny story about Eleanor Roosevelt coming to Hunter College and basically being like, why don't these women have guns? And then lo and behold, 2 weeks later they had guns. But the point is there was a lot of hemming and hawing, even about that level of sort of engagement with the front line. But like the debate today, despite all that hemming and hawing, the reality was when you look at women's experiences like Gertrude Pearson or the flight nurses, people deployed abroad, they were having experiences that were as close to combat as you could possibly imagine. And so the practice was, the practice and the theory were totally misaligned then as they are now, I think.
So we just have like 2 minutes left. I have 2 people on my list.
Okay.
I'm going to have them both ask for questions and then toss it back to you.
Great.
Final thoughts. So Casper and Phil, over to you.
Thank you, Lena. Excellent presentation. I think you're a very confident and calm presenter as well, which is enjoyable to listen to. My question is also sort of a comparative one. So the scale of World War II required a massive increase in functions that needed to be executed and for women to become part in supporting the war effort. How does World War II compare to later wars such as the Korean War or the Vietnam War? Which roles did they have functionally in those wars? And were there comparatively more women in support roles or other types of roles vis-a-vis World War II? And are there any inferences we can make about the effectiveness of US forces in those wars compared to World War II because of women involvement in supporting the war?
Great question. Yeah.
You made my week easy. Great talk. Your talk about what women could do, what Caitlin's question on selection effects got me thinking about. I was in a fighter squadron when they integrated women fighter pilots, and one of the things that I saw was how the interaction effect, not just what they could do, but how they changed the organization. My experience was explicitly misogynistic organizations that suddenly headed, well, I won't say they weren't misogynistic, but they were implicitly afterwards. It actually changed the culture. And so my question to you is, do you you see that in any of these organizations, when the women come in, what interaction effect do they have on the entire organization's performance, other than their just own efficiencies?
It's a great question. On the question of sort of generalizability to other wars, I haven't actually gone through, this is another thing that I'll do along with looking at the different countries, or combatants, I should say. I haven't gone through and looked at sort of percentage-wise women who served in later wars. I do know that particularly in Korea and then later in Vietnam, the constraints, even though they're integrated on a permanent basis, I'm sure many of you know this history, the constraints were significant. One of the places, although I know I just hammered this point home, one of the places that, again, women show up over and over again in these really fascinating roles is in the nursing community. I think that was definitely true of Vietnam. There's a great book, which I actually haven't read yet, don't blame me, but it's by, I can't remember her name, Kristen Hanna maybe, called The Women. It's a historical fiction, I think, but it's about this community. I think what I've found in my conversations today, even about the ways in which women are being integrated into various services, I'm going to kind of not answer your question because I want to make an important point about today. We are in a recruiting environment where we need everybody we can get. And to Phil's point, often women who come into Caitlin's point, women who are coming into the organization have to overcome so much and have to be there with such enthusiasm and such gusto that they are fundamentally going to improve the organization in wider ways. And so I think what we've seen through the course of this is that in the face of extraordinary disparagement, women have time and time again had a major impact on the organization itself. And today, in the environment that we are in, where recruiting is an enormous challenge and it is not getting any better, we could learn a lot from what these women did in World War II and how to integrate them and how to acknowledge that they have something to contribute and to make that sort of very clear from a recruiting perspective. So I do think that's taken on board to a certain extent. I only have anecdotal evidence from the past several years, but I think increasingly DoD is starting to get that message, and I hope that they continue to get that message. But I would have to go back and look more closely at the remaining stuff. Phil, to your point, I think it's an excellent one. It is sort of the other side of the coin to Caitlin's point, which is that not only are they more efficient in their jobs, but what the data says overwhelmingly, and part of the problem with this being such a relatively small proportion of women is that not a lot of guys got to interact with women, but we should wish that they had, because the men who did interact with women were even some of the biggest skeptics, like you can imagine, sort of an old salt kind of guy. There's these great stories about not wanting to change the bathrooms and things like that, who then become total converts, right? They love having women. They think they do a terrific job. That's almost always the case. But because so few men were interacting with them, a lot of that criticism, that slander campaign, all of those beliefs around it were from men who most often had not engaged with a woman in the field or in uniform. When they did, they were almost always convinced. So, that should tell you something about whether or not what we should be doing today. Yeah.
Wonderful. This was a tremendous seminar. It's so great to see you.
Thank
you so much for coming.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you. That was fun. That was great.